So this session is very much focused on developing the knowledge, skill needed to improve older pupils' reading fluency and comprehension. Now, I'm going to pitch it at kind of Key Stage 2, Key Stage 3. However, even if you're in a phase before that or after it, I think there are lots of things you're going to take out of this session that you can go away and really consider in your context. And whether you're new to fluency or you're an experienced hand, I'm really hoping that this is the time and the space for you to really consider what it means for you and your pupils. So hopefully you'll go away with some kind of ideas, responses to these 4 big questions here. We're going to think about what fluency is, why it's an appropriate focus for pupils of all ages, but in particular today for older pupils, whether that's Key Stage 2, Key Stage 3 or beyond. We're going to think about some long-standing, some quite traditional approaches to reading aloud, and in particular round-robin reading, and we're going to think about why that's problematic. And then we're going to look at some, what I think are easy to implement strategies to improve our fluency practice. So I'd like to start with this statement. Many of you have probably seen it before. It does come from the dreaded O, but I do like this statement because it's this idea that in order for older pupils to really be able to access and make sense of the secondary school curriculum, they need to be equipped with the skills and strategies to be able to read what we call complex academic texts, both with fluency and good comprehension, so good understanding. And I think for many years, reading fluency has largely been considered a skill taught at primary level, and the assumption being that most secondary pupils can read aloud with sufficient competency, so that secondary school teachers don't really need to consider it. And I think it would be naive to think that all primary schools have got this nailed as well. I think there will be some primary schools up and down the country, internationally, wherever you've come from today, that it may not be on your radar yet. So prominent researchers like Professor Tim Rosinski have also argued that for too long, pupils move into those upper phases and continue to struggle as disfluent readers. And there was a recent small study that they released an article, some kind of findings on, and it was looking at oral reading fluency in college graduates, so our equivalent of university age. And what they wanted to explore was the part that reading fluency plays in making US students ready for college. And they were able to determine roughly the fluency levels needed to be successful. And then that gave them a bit of an indicator as to what we should aim for our secondary school pupils. And they determined like particular reading rates and so on. But I just thought it was an interesting thing to think about, because reading fluency really isn't age or stage specific. It really spans across the whole of education. And that's because throughout education, the texts that we read with our pupils gradually get harder and harder, more complex in terms of the language and so on. And you have that progressive fluency there as well. So I just thought that was quite a good place to start, really. And there's this key question for me that I think we should all consider, and it's whether or not older pupils with strong early reading skills, whether that's enough for them to cope with the increased demands in the secondary school curriculum. I think recent SATs results, they're pretty in line with pre-pandemic results. They indicate there's still probably some way to go here. We know that a quarter of pupils are still not meeting the expected standard in reading in Key Stage 2 before they come up to us. But we cannot make the assumption that all these pupils simply need more phonics instruction. Some will, and that's it, important that we recognise that we use diagnostic assessment with precision and don't make assumptions about what we think pupils might need. However, many older students are going to need much more than that. And this is a really important part, I think, of transition. There's an interesting evidence review report from the EEF. If you've never come across it before, it's called Reading at the Transition. It talks about this concept, this idea of code switching, and the struggles that Year 6 readers have as they move into Year 7. So in Key Stage 2, more often than not, pupils will have one teacher, one classroom, one teaching style. In many ways, that's easier to develop consistency of routines, especially when you're developing reading. Whereas when they switch to Key Stage 3 and go into that secondary school phase, they may then have to cope with 5 or 6 different subjects, which comes with different subject kind of languages, academic codes, 6 different teachers, different classrooms, and that's a really exhausting change of regime for them. So we have to think, how are we going to support those pupils as they transition to really cope with those increased language demands? So I think there is often this assumption that pupils with strong early reading skills are naturally able to cope with this code switching, but it's not true. It's almost like somebody presses that reset button again for them. So let's think about what we sometimes notice about these struggling older readers, and then we'll start to really dig into reading fluency. So we're often faced with these symptoms, these pupil behaviours that can be traced back to gaps in reading development. We've all probably seen how pupils can become quite disaffected, anxious when they're struggling to keep up with their peers. You know, we also talk about this disadvantage, don't we, and disadvantaged pupils and the narrative around closing the attainment gap. What we really need to think about is pupil need, especially when it comes to reading. Closing the disadvantage gap is about closing the language and literacy gap. And it's important that we dig beneath the surface of these symptoms so that we can discover the root causes, put strategies in place to intervene and support. And here, and I'm going to use this model a couple of times in today's session, you'll see the EEF's Reading House model, which is an adaptation of the work of Professor Kate Kane and others. And we can see here that the root causes of some of these symptoms can be traced back to early reading skills. There might be gaps in pupils' knowledge of the alphabetic code. They may have limited vocabulary. They may have limited knowledge of text structure and genre and print. They may lack metacognitive reading skills. But for many pupils, the neglected room within this house is the fluency room. They're often lacking in reading fluency practice, both that breadth of opportunity, but also that honing in on it as a skill, the depth of that development. So that's why we're going to focus on reading fluency today. And we also know that oral language unlocks reading proficiency. It's that foundation upon which word reading and language comprehension is built upon. So we all love a tree diagram, don't we? This is from the Early Intervention Foundation. You may or may not have heard these phrases before, but it's this idea that language can be receptive or expressive, receptive being the foundation. So it's about how we understand others, develop our listening, the kind of important roots of comprehension. And then young children and pupils can develop their expressive language. So their use of speech, gestures, how they communicate using correct words and language, different contexts and so forth. And I think going back to these basics, these really kind of preparing for literacy essentials are really, really important when we are trying to get to grips with why something like reading fluency needs to be prioritised in our schools. And Professor Pamela Snow, I quite like this idea. She often says that oral language and kind of reading and literacy skills are like these inseparable friends. They take turns to piggyback on each other during the school years and beyond. And I think that's very similar to this famously quoted statement from James Britton, this idea that reading and writing float on this sea of talk. So we cannot develop reading and writing sufficiently if we're not focusing on oral language and oracy. And oral reading is a crucial part of that. Okay. So if we go back now to what we call consensus models of reading, we can start to unpick how pupils develop their reading ability and the role that fluency plays within this. So here you've got on the left the simple view of reading from Goff and Tumner. You've got the EEF model there, and then I'll talk about the myth in a moment. But these two models on the left-hand side, they are linked. The house is grounded in the principles of the simple view of reading. And both of these models help us to understand that reading comprehension is this outcome of an interaction between word reading and language comprehension. There's a slight irony in the title because reading is not simple. It is, in fact, a very complex, multifaceted skill. And I suppose that's the one downside with the simple view of reading, that reading fluency isn't an explicit feature of it, but it is in the Reading House model, and that's why I keep coming back to this one. And it's an important room in the Reading House model. It's on the word reading side of the house, but I think equally it could be placed in the right-hand side of the house as well. I like to think that it should straddle in between, that there should be this secret doorway that allows a pupil to go from word reading to comprehension and back again, because there is this reciprocal development that happens when we have a focus on reading fluency. So there is a myth here. It says myth number 1, and I'm going to refer to a few different myths and misconceptions through the session, and they link to a resource that I will signpost you to at the end of the session that's freely available online. But I think at this stage, it's quite important to dispel this myth. So the myth is accurate decoding automatically leads to good comprehension. Okay, why is this a myth? Well, we know that word reading fluency, it is important. We must teach pupils to decode expertly as early as possible, but it isn't sufficient on its own to guarantee comprehension. Some pupils will become really skilled at word recognition, but then struggle to comprehend what it is they're actually reading. And therefore, fluency practice has this role to play to bridge this transition to better reading comprehension. And just as I'm talking about this now, I'm thinking about a year 11 student who I did a diagnostic with just last week. His teacher flagged up some concerns. He'd only just arrived actually at the end of year 10 to the school. And she had an inkling that something wasn't right. We did a York diagnostic assessment. His word reading was excellent. It was equivalent of a reading age of about 16. When we did the fluency and the comprehension aspects of it, that was much lower. The reading age was kind of 10/11, so 5 years below that word reading. He's going to really struggle to access those GCSE texts this year. And he's going to face a lot of challenges. But this is a myth. Just because you're a good word reader doesn't necessarily mean that's going to automatically make you a good comprehender. Okay, and there are many reasons why older pupils will struggle with their reading. So we've talked about that transition with Key Stage 2 pupils coming up and standards nationally not being where they need to be. But there are other things I think we need to consider here. So some may need support with their word reading. The trust that I work for, we have a program that specifically targets that to help them with the decoding, their automatic reading of whole words and their fluency. But it's important to note a few things. So poor word reading doesn't prevent comprehension, but it is a barrier. Okay. We know that strong decoding skills developed in primary school might not actually be fluent enough for the academic language demands placed upon them at secondary. Which I think that's the thing that needs unpicking a little bit further in schools, I think. And also, being a fluent reader of fiction narrative texts doesn't automatically translate to being a fluent reader of non-fiction texts. And when we think about the move to secondary school and the increase in informational texts across the curriculum, that's a big challenge for us as well. So it's how is reading fluency going to help us to address some of these big challenges that we face? Okay, we're going to have a pause in a moment, and I'm going to try and get you interacting with this a little bit. But I want us to really empathise with the experience of a struggling older student. And I'm going to introduce the student to you. I'm going to describe his experience, and then we're going to think about what some of the challenges might be for him and his teachers. Okay, so Jack, he is a year 7 pupil. He has a reading age of a 9-year-old. So he is one of those students who has come up from primary school not really ready for the secondary school curriculum. It's Monday morning. The day begins quite typically. This is the routine that he has every Monday morning. and it starts with tutor time. So his morning usually begins reading a text as part of the form time tutor programme. They have developed a new programme called Drop Everything and Listen, which is where their tutor reads a text aloud to them. And Jack really likes this calm start to the day. He enjoys listening to his form tutor, Mr. Parker, because he puts on a really dramatic voice. Really does remind him of experiences at primary school. So it's a really positive start for him. As he goes to his first lesson, period 1, we start to see his enthusiasm for reading quickly fade. It's history, and everyone in this history class at the start are expected to read in silence for 10 minutes. Now, they've previously been asked to choose their own book from the library, and Jack's got a book, but he doesn't want to admit that the book he's chosen is too difficult for him. So he keeps his head down and he pretends to read, and because he's not causing any issues, not disrupting, it goes unnoticed every lesson. Okay, so that's the second part of the morning. After history, he then moves to English. And his English teacher, Mrs. Thomas, really excited about the reading because they're reading Oliver Twist, and they're going to really enjoy this today. And she goes around the class and assigns a paragraph of the text to every pupil. And she says, we're going to all take it in turns today to read aloud. Now, Jack is 10th in line. Okay, instead of following the 9 sections that come before him and really thinking about what's happening in that text, he focuses for the whole of the time waiting, trying to locate his part of the text to read, trying to rehearse it in his head. And then he comes across some vocabulary that he is really unfamiliar to him. It's quite archaic. He soon realizes that he doesn't have a clue what these words mean, let alone how to say them out loud. Now, Jack's story is not an unusual experience for an older pupil. And even if you're in the primary stage, you may still identify with some of the approaches that you see happening here. His school is obviously trying to prioritise reading. They are well-intentioned approaches, but despite their best efforts, they're not really supporting him to become a more confident, fluent reader. So I'm just going to pause here because I'd like you now to think about, what are the challenges then here? Why is it that these approaches are not really helping Jack to become a more fluent reader? And if you can, I'd like you to just put some of your thoughts into the chat, just so that I know you're all there and I'm not talking into a screen, but to really kind of unpick this as well. Okay, we'll take about 3 minutes to do that. Thank you, Emma and Karen. Yeah. Thanks, Mary. Yeah. 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 So there are things around kind of like this social emotional side of things. There's a lack of pre-teaching vocabulary, maybe lack of teacher understanding, awareness about how pupils learn to read, some passivity, absolutely the pressure. Can you imagine if, as adults, we were on a course, a conference, and we were given a text that was really unfamiliar, and we were all asked to read it out loud. We've never read it before. We're going to feel that pressure, aren't we? So I can only imagine what it's like for our pupils. Yeah. Oh, these are great. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, and we don't know whether Jack was supported to get a book or not. We assume not. And that's something that is quite common, especially when you get to secondary school. Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, put him on the spot. It's that cold read. Brilliant. Yeah. Wow, there's lots there. That's fantastic. Yeah, the one size fits all. That's brilliant. I'm not going to read any more of those out. I'm sure you can scroll through some of those, but you are all absolutely right. There are multitude of challenges and problems here, and we're going to explore why each example is a little bit problematic, and we're going to link it to some of the myths and misconceptions around reading fluency. So if we take the first example, tutor time, so we know that listening to and following a text being read aloud by a more capable reader can help struggling readers to bypass those sticking points at phonemic or semantic word level so that they can focus on comprehension. Okay, we also know that it's an important part of oral reading fluency practice if it's modelled well in more of a metacognitive thinking aloud fashion. And we also know that reading aloud to children and to pupils is motivating. It does engage them as readers. There is a nostalgia that comes with it from early childhood. But on its own, that isn't enough. And actually, there's lots of secondary schools that I've worked with or collaborated with that have implemented a tutor reading programme where the onus is on the member of staff to model that expert reading. That's a very good start, but if that's the only thing that you're doing around reading fluency, it's not quite enough. You do need to be balancing that with opportunities for pupils themselves to practice their own reading fluency. So this links to myth number 4 of the document that I'll share with you later on. Let's have a look at the second example. So this one was the history lesson, the drop everything and read. Now, when we look at the evidence around this, silent, sustained reading, we know can have inconsistent effects on motivation and outcomes. Silent reading itself does not lead to improved reading fluency. Okay, and that's really important to understand. But there's no denying that there is the connection between oral and silent reading. And it is important because fluent oral reading leads to fluent silent reading. And when we think about students as they're progressing through SATs and then into GCSEs later on, it is one of the goals of learning to read, to be able to read fluently and silently. So we shouldn't do away with it completely, but we should be really considerate about it. So thinking more carefully about how we use that approach. The approach that is in this example here is not that helpful for all of the reasons that you've just talked about in the chat bar. I think what we have to think about is, well, which text do we want students to read silently? And who chooses that? When do we want them to do this and why? What's the purpose? And who are we doing it with and why? Where are they at within their reading development? And more importantly, if we're going to ask them to do that, is there a way that we can still monitor their comprehension kind of post-reading or during that reading? So there's some considerations there, and that links to one of the myths as well. And then the last one, this is one I feel particularly passionate about. If anybody's come to any of my sessions before, you know I do talk a little bit about round-robin reading, probably a little bit too much. But this is an example of round-robin reading practice, okay? It links one of the myths, but I'm going to talk about it in more depth now. So imagine typical secondary classroom, okay? Rows, obviously not in every classroom, but let's go for like a traditional model here. Every pupil has been assigned a bit to read in a text. We're going to go around the classroom like this, okay? I am sure that the majority of us here have used this technique before. I definitely have, and that's over 20 years of English teaching. I have simply mimicked how my teachers approached reading aloud in the classroom. I wasn't taught in my PGCE about how best to manage this, and since then, nobody else has shown me a better way. But I think we have a really good evidence base now with lots of alternatives. And when we think about round-robin reading, okay, if we just go back to the basics, basically, pupil has their own copy of the text, teacher selects at random, then they read one after the other. And I think the original kind of purpose of this, it's about engaging pupils, it's about increasing the participation. And it's about allowing teachers to hear pupils read aloud on a regular basis. But I do wonder how many pupils actually get to read before a lesson ends. I know when I think about my practice over the years, when I've done this, you only really do get a handful of students having that opportunity. And there are many other strategies that are out there that people use. The phrase popcorn reading, Teach Like a Champion has strategies like control the game. It's now a bit more about phase reading. And I just think it's okay to use some of these strategies, but we need to be aware that a lot of these strategies are actually more about making pupils accountable for the reading, and it's more about managing their behaviour in the classroom rather than actually supporting their development of reading fluency. So I think that's really important to kind of scratch that surface about what does read aloud look like in your classroom or your school, and is this achieving the right purpose? Have you got the right goals for it? And that's because we have a wealth of evidence now that really tells us that we should not be doing round robin reading anymore. I'll just give you a moment to have a skim of some of these snippets of evidence. So Professor Tim Shanahan, some of you may have heard about him. He blogs regularly about all aspects of literacy, and he actually says that round robin reading allows for so little reading practice that the only person who is probably doing the learning at that point is the one who's reading during round robin, which means that there are, 25, 26, 27 other students who are sitting there just waiting for their turn. And it's this idea that this exposure to minimal practice often prohibits rather than facilitates like the ability to read and those legitimate purposes of reading aloud. And obviously we know, and as many of you have already identified, there can be that damaging effect on students' social emotional growth. We want pupils to feel success in the classroom, don't we? Meaningful participation, that supportive, inclusive environment. So I think we need to rethink whole class reading aloud practices so that they are more inclusive, so that it prioritises well-being, and more importantly, so that we're actually supporting struggling readers to catch up and then keep up. So how do we do this? So we have to go back to the reading and the science of reading, go back to the comprehension house, because we know that helps to put fluency front and centre. It's a key component of reading development. And as I said before, this word fluency room can equally be on the right-hand side of the house, because we know that fluency is the bridge from word reading to comprehension. So fluent word reading enables comprehension to flourish, and then actually comprehension enables pupils to make those conscious decisions about how they read words with expression, how they use phrasing to reflect the meaning of a text. So let's really look at fluency here now, because it's important to know what it is and what it isn't. So we know that fluent readers can read words accurately because they've got good knowledge of our alphabetic code. They understand that the letters on the page that they're reading represent the sounds in spoken words. And they need the right kind of quality and quantity of practice so that their reading becomes automatic, which means that they read at an appropriate speed that doesn't require a great deal of effort. And that's what we refer to as automaticity. But that I've just noticed as well. Did you notice that, Fliss? That the EEF model there has a spelling mistake on it. Yeah, let's make sure they've changed that one. And then the third element of reading fluency is prosody. So this is about, can pupils read with appropriate stress and intonation? Now, these three elements are important skills in isolation, but they also work together, interdependent building blocks. And if one of these blocks isn't quite secure, it's really difficult for reading fluency to be achieved overall. And we know that if you have a fluent reading style, that's going to support your comprehension because it's freeing up your limited cognitive resources from focusing on word reading that can then be redirected to making meaning of the text. So let's have a look. So you've got some references at the end of the session. Here's a tool, a professional development tool, if you wanted to use this back in your own school to support colleagues to also understand what fluency is. And then this is the tool that I've been referring to so far, the myths and misconceptions. In the words of Tim Rosinski, fluency really has had a history of being misunderstood. So it's a helpful tool to really keep coming back to. And in particular, I think I want to draw your attention to these two. So fluency is sometimes confused with how quickly a pupil can read a piece of text. And the aim of fluency practice really should be to support pupils to read at a pace which allows their comprehension to flourish, whether that is reading aloud or whether that's silently. And it's important to really know that faster reading does not lead to better reading, and that fluency practice, as I said right at the beginning, is not age or stage specific. It enables readers of all ages to access and comprehend increasingly challenging texts throughout education. So I like to think then, if we're not going to use round-robin reading and similar strategies, what is it that we're supposed to be doing instead? What does the evidence tell us that we can really kind of rely on? What are the best bets? Well, I think the first thing is we've got to have a kind of a common goal of whole class reading, and that should be to optimise opportunities for everybody to read aloud and for everybody to have a chance to practice their reading fluency. And the research and the evidence points to these two main approaches that you can see on the left here. So the first one is guided oral reading instruction, where an adult or an expert peer models the fluent reading of a text, and the pupils read the same text aloud. They give each other feedback. So whether that's shared story time or whether it's tutor time, reading aloud program, those are the kind of focus areas there. What I would say, though, is if we are leading on this back in school or across a trust or group of schools, are we really equipping our teachers with the knowledge and skill to be able to do this effectively? Because it doesn't come naturally to everybody. And we know that through challenges of implementation in the secondary phase. So we've got to think carefully about our professional development programmes that go alongside that. The second area that the evidence points to is what we call repeated reading. And that involves rereading short passages until a suitable level of fluency and understanding is achieved. And I think at this point, dispelling another couple of myths is really important. So the idea that reading a text once is enough is a bit of a misconception. It's rarely enough for good comprehension to take place. Repeated reading is not just for the sake of it. It's about going back to the text with a different goal each time to layer up that I suppose, the ability to access and really get to grips with and make meaning from a text. But also, sometimes people think that reading fluency is only about using fiction text, and that's a myth. We know that fluency practice can be suited to both fiction and non-fiction, as long as we're choosing the text really carefully. And actually, there's I'm sure Felicia won't mind me mentioning this, but there's a research school up in the northeast called Townend Research School, and they've been doing some great work around developing fluency with non-fiction, especially in the primary school. And I think that's brilliant as part of that, preparing the students for the demands of that secondary phase. So, definitely look into that if you're interested. Now, within these two approaches, there are many what we call assisted reading strategies that can be used, like the strategies in our teaching toolkit, and these are some of them here. Okay, so we've got things like paired reading, recorded reading when pupils record themselves and each other, listen back, do some peer assessment, self-assessment, choral reading, and different kind of versions of that, whether it's call and response, my turn, your turn, echo reading, mumble reading. Mumble reading isn't talked about a lot, actually, I don't think, but I think once you get to grips with what that is, it's very simple, where everybody is reading at the same time, but it's at such a low volume that you can't really hear one student over another. Actually works quite well with older students, from my experience. But then there's a technique, a sequence teaching called Reader's Theatre. It's a shame it's called theatre, I think, because I think sometimes that can be off-putting, especially for secondary school teachers. But I know that this can be used really, really well in a whole range of subjects. I've seen it used in history, in geography, in science, and this is what Reader's Theatre is. So I'll just give you a moment to have a bit of a skim of this. It is a sequence to teaching that combines all of these evidence-informed approaches and strategies. And I'll just give you a moment to have a look at that now. So you'll see there is guided oral reading in this, there's repeated reading, but it's a very structured approach. It's actually quite motivating for students because of the structure there. It is engaging, it can be adapted for fiction and non-fiction, suited across different subjects, across primary and secondary. And actually, you don't have to follow it to the letter. You can make adjustments and adaptations to suit the needs of your subject and also your pupils in front of you. But that's just one way of employing some of these strategies. I'm just going to walk you through now some other strategies, takeaway strategies that you could go away with and really think about, especially if you're teaching older students. So if we think about the first approach in guided oral reading instruction, so the adult being that expert reader that's modelling expert reading, supporting older pupils to decode with accuracy, to pronounce new vocabulary correctly, to read with automaticity is really crucial. And we have to keep helping them to do that as the texts increase in difficulty. So here you've got a very short snippet from a science textbook. The scenario might be that this topic has been taught in a previous lesson. This is a bit of a retrieval start to the next lesson. Maybe the teacher is going to reread this because it's an opportunity for pupils to hear and practice using some of this really complex vocabulary that's already been pre-taught. So it's that revisiting and reusing of vocabulary. So it might be that when he or she gets to these words that are in the box in the middle, that everybody is expected to say these words out loud. They're going to chorally read them. And I often say this to secondary school teachers, that fluency practice doesn't have to be about really, really long texts. It can be at a kind of minute level. It can be at word level, and start there, and then you can build up as your confidence as a practitioner increases. And remember, pupils are not going to be able to cross that fluency bridge to comprehension unless we put some of these strategies in place. So that's one example of a science subject reading. I want to show you this as well, because one of the things that's often a challenge when we're reading texts is when we read text where there is very little punctuation, and therefore struggling students struggle to work out where they're supposed to pause, stop, emphasize. And this is where what we call phrasing comes into play. So text phrasing, it's this ability to group words together while you're reading, and it helps then to make reading sound more like your normal speech pattern. It helps to increase your reading speed, even though it's not about always reading faster, and ultimately helps to improve that comprehension. Sometimes, like these phrase boundaries are invisible to our readers. So as teachers, when we're reading them, if you've got a visualizer in your classroom, you put the text underneath there, you can be really explicit there and make that invisible more visible to our students so that they've got that experience. And this is just a text that some of our schools use in my trust for one of their tutor reading programs. And it might just be that literally you're text marking that piece of text as you're reading to support them, so they know where those appropriate places are within the sentences. And then another aspect of the guided expert reading part is about how we model prosody, how we're using punctuation, emphasis, intonation when we read aloud. And obviously that's going to be slightly different when we're looking at fiction and non-fiction, but actually prosody is not just about English text. It's not just about text that you might read in drama and performing arts. It's about how we're using those structures within the text to inform the decisions we make when we read them out loud. So here you've got The Goldfish Boy, again, another really popular text for year 6, 7 classes. And here the punctuation and the structures are very much there to bring the characterization to life. So the author's very much here intending to create a sense of curiosity and intrigue about the narrator, about the situation. So you've got these extended pauses, what should be quite varied intonation, emphasis on powerful words like weirdo. These things are important so that when this text is read aloud, it has its intended effect that the author set out to achieve. And one of the things that I always tell colleagues when I work with them is the biggest tip is to make sure you've read ahead before pupils. Never go to a class with a text cold. Read it aloud to yourself before you read it to them, because you are the expert. You've got to be the one that's modeling those choices. So that's just a big tip there. And also read at a slightly slower pace than you would normally do. It's that Goldilocks principle, not too fast, not too slow, but modeling that explicit think aloud as well as you go through there. So those are just some of the markers there that you would use to make those choices. So the first approach was guided instruction. The second one was repeated reading. And interestingly, when I've been working with some colleagues in maths and art, it's quite interesting the way they've interpreted this and actually found it to be quite a useful strategy for supporting students to read like subject experts. And we know lots of schools are now really thinking about disciplinary literacy. So here, this 3-read strategy in maths is very much about, you might have a problem here that's only 1 or 2 sentences long. So it's a text on a very small scale, but it's about approaching that, first of all, trying to understand it first. So decode it. What are the facts? Which words do I know? Which words don't I know? Which bits of information don't I need? We're going to knock it out, cross those bits out so that we can really hone in on what's important. We then might go back to that text and really try to make a little bit of meaning from that. This might be using what we call reciprocal reading strategies. We might be clarifying vocabulary and ideas. We might be asking ourselves questions. We might be making predictions about what mathematical strategy we're going to have to use here. And once we've decoded, we've made meaning, we then go back to it a third time and apply the mathematical strategy. So it's a process for reading. Repeated reading has become a structured process to support pupils to access complex texts in maths. And here's another example in art. So one of my colleagues, when we did some work around this, decided that it was going to be the 3Ds. So the first time they looked at a visual text, it was very much, like say what you see, describe what you can see there, get the gist of what's happening in this piece of art, objects, colours, people, and so on. Then go back to it and really start to dig for deeper meaning. So again, ask questions, clarify why that colour, what's the connotation of that, wonder why that's positioned there. And then once you've made that meaning and you've done that kind of deeper level analysis, In art, it was about, okay, let's draw some inspiration from this to create our own art. So you can see there, the quite nuanced ways of using a generic strategy, but that's why I think reading fluency practice, it is appropriate for all subjects. And it doesn't have to be a one size fits all. It doesn't have to look the same. And here's a final example around how you can incorporate paired reading. So it's this idea that you can actually use paired reading quite strategically, whether you're pairing up less fluent with more fluent readers, whether you're deciding that you're going to pair up with a similar ability, or you're going to put an adult with one of your most struggling readers, because that's where that expert support really needs to be targeted. And it's about that kind of peer coaching. And there's obviously lots of evidence around that peer tutoring aspect of there too. So you've seen lots of kind of little strategies there, some approaches for different subjects. But one of the things that I would urge you to also do is to think about, what does a fluent reader sound like? And actually, what you see here is it's a grid taken from the Key Stage 2 guidance report from the EF. It's adapted from the work of Zuttel and Rosinski. It's designed to be used with students, but I've actually used this a lot with adults as part of professional development, so that we can explore how we should be modelling that expert reading for our pupils. And that's been quite a success with some of the schools that I've worked with on there. I think if you were actively teaching reading fluency within whole class settings, we're going to improve that quality kind of wave one high quality teaching offer. But then there will be some students who, when we use diagnostic tests, they may need a little bit more targeted support. So, how are we doing that? How are we balancing the whole class entitlement for everybody? But then how are we identifying and supporting those who we think are going to require some more fluency support? If you haven't come across them, so the ARC diagnostic test will test a pupil for reading fluency. You've obviously got this kind of descriptive, what does it kind of look and sound like? If you are a Microsoft school, Microsoft Teams have their reading progress software now, which is like really developing, and that's quite a quick way of measuring and monitoring and tracking pupils' reading development in terms of fluency. But yeah, there are a lot of tools there. All of these tools that I've referenced today can be found free of charge on the EEF website. And alongside those tools that you can use for yourselves, for professional development for colleagues, there are also some accompanying blogs that you can go away and read. There is a podcast, there is a primary school video that exemplifies what reading fluency might look like there. So do go away and have a bit of a dig around those resources and see whether any would be useful for you. There's also this resource, and a lot of these resources I worked with Hearts for Learning to collaborate on, but this one in particular was very much about, what does reading fluency, or what might reading fluency practice look like across the key stages? So it starts off with the early years and it goes all the way through to kind of key stage 3. There is a podcast that kind of goes with this, the Hearts for Learning, Alex Quigley on there, Tim Rosinski, and that, I think that will probably help to consolidate some of the key messages from today. So do check that out and have a listen if you're on your bus or your train journey to work. And then the final thing really is, I hope that you take away some of these key messages from today. So one of our EEF colleagues, Caroline Bilton, once said this to me, and it's stuck with me ever since. And it's this idea that, and you could say this about all sorts of different aspects of education, couldn't you? But reading fluency practice really is helpful for all, and it's harmful to none, but it's really crucial for some. And actually, if we get this right in the classroom, we will reduce the need to withdraw students and reduce the need for that additional intervention, and improve the quality of experience for everybody else at the same time. I want you to take away that fluency is a key part of word reading in early reading, but also transitioning as pupils move through the stages, that it is the bridge to comprehension. We often think that people struggle with their comprehension and go straight to that, but actually let's go back and let's really think about whether they are reading fluently or not. I think it's got real potential to support vocabulary instruction across the phases, and for me it's about really optimizing those opportunities for all pupils of all ages to read aloud and developing that culture in which they feel comfortable to do that. And then my final message is reading fluency practice is definitely not round robin reading or similar. So I just wanted to say a big thank you for coming along to the session. Whether you are watching this live, you're coming along live, or whether you're watching it afterwards, please do get in contact if you want to just share your journey, or whether you want to ask questions, share resources, or just simply talk about anything related to reading fluency. I'd love to do that. And just thank you again for your time.